Continuing our discussion of the fire sermon, we left off with a look at the three preludes or overture passages that introduce us to what would ultimately be the most famous passage from the fire sermon, that of the typist and her lover returning from sea. With a look at Mr. Sweeney himself, the rake, and Mrs. Porter, the image of an illicit love affair, the rape of Philomela by King Tiresias, a brutal assault of sexuality and rape, and then the proposal of Mr. Eugenides for a homosexual episode at the Metropole over the weekend. Three distinct different perversions and corruptions of pure, innocent, sacred love. Now we get to the passage itself, remarking on the typist, the female typist returning home from work, preparing her room and her bedroom for her lover to return. And yet, in the wasteland, no real intimacy is possible. So even this section will be despairing and will be inconclusive, ultimately. The first thing to note is that this passage presents, at least, a fairly strict rhyme scheme. And Eliot is typically intentional with everything that he included in The Wasteland, although it went through several edits from Ezra Pound. It's safe to assume that Eliot had an overarching methodology in how he wrote and constructed the different parts of The Wasteland. And for this passage to follow a fairly regular rhyme scheme seems to recall the kind of love poetry that he is trying to imitate in this scene. However, the irony is quite thick that here we do not have the standard glorified, ideal love sequence that we would tend to expect from love poetry in antiquity. Here we have a much reduced, much more unsatisfying depiction of love in The Wasteland. But he says, at the violet hour, or at twilight, which tends to be the time of day where the magical and supernatural occurs. Yet we know that the nymphs have departed, that there is no real prospect of magic and supernatural reality any longer. But at the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi, throbbing, waiting. Here we have a picture of the typist ending her day at work, her eyes turning upward from the desk, the day at work being over, and the human engine, perhaps a reference to her heart, like a taxi throbbing and waiting for the encounter she's anticipating that evening with her lover. Perhaps the human engine being just a reference to her as this mechanized object, which we will see her to be. She waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting for the evening encounter to take place. I, Tiresias, now we have an indication of who the narrator is. We've had this first-person narrator throughout the section of the fire sermon so far. And Tiresias as the narrator is a rather interesting choice for Eliot. Tiresias was a mythological creature who, like the Sibyl, was a seer or a prophet. Remember the seer in the epigraph, the Sibyl in the epigraph who was cursed, doomed to eternal life without eternal youth, that she was a seer or a prophetess. Now we have Tiresias, who is functioning as a prophetic voice within the wasteland for us. He is the speaker that perhaps most resembles Eliot as the speaker who has a broader understanding of the dangers and pitfalls of the wasteland we live in. But he's a mythological figure who was cursed and experienced both male and female identities. He had the fortune of understanding human life from both angles, that he was male and female at the same time. As also a part of the curse, he was blinded physically. But we'll note that this physical blindness doesn't necessarily bring any relevance to what Tiresias claims to be able to see. What he is attempting to see is ultimate meaning and depth and perception of reality and truth beyond the physical realm. Tiresias is attempting to see beyond the physical landscape of the wasteland and the interactions of the characters within it. As we've seen throughout the Fire Sermon so far, there is a level of sight and insight and depth to the narration here that is able to cut through the charade and the routines and monotony of the characters and interactions and events that occur within the simple scenery. Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, male and female identity, old man with wrinkled female breasts, there's our indication that he represents the all man, that he represents all of mankind, both male and female. He is a voice that perhaps is the central voice to the wasteland, the only credible voice that can speak to the male and female experiences separately and together in one narrative voice. Though he's blind, he can see at the violet hour, this twilight hour where we can imagine something meaningful will take place, though we should know better. The evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea. So what Tiresias is seeing here as the prophet is the expectation of a wonderful homecoming for the typist to see her lover come home from sea. What ought to be a beautiful reuniting, a beautiful homecoming, Tiresias is able to see beyond that. He is blind to the physical truth that can often be misleading and manipulative. What our eyes can see is often not as true as what they cannot see. So Tiresias serves as the perfect narrator here, that he can understand and empathize with the male perspective of love and the female, but he also is blinded to the charade. He's blinded to the facade. He's blinded to the physical events and details, and is only able to see what lies beyond. He has that mythical, magical foresight, and he is about to narrate for us this scene, and we ought to be able to see alongside him the failures of this scene and what they portend for those of us caught in the wasteland. So the typist is home at tea time. She clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out food in tins. She's preparing a place for her lover. Out of the window, perilously spread her drying combinations, touched by the sun's last rays. She is drying her laundry. On the divan are piled, at night, her bed. So here's an interesting detail, that she is lower class and poor. She's common. That for her divan to also function as her bed, for her to work long hours as a typist, deep into the violet hour, she is probably a lower class citizen. Much like the lower class wife we saw in a game of chess. Stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, he is giving us his narration again, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. So he gives us the details of the scene itself, but he foretells the rest. He gives the deeper story. He is prophesying. He is allowing us to see a destiny or a fate that is common to all who are living in the wasteland. So he, giving us this sense of perceiving the scene and foretelling the rest, is allowing us to get into the skin of this scene. We are not meant to simply see the scene and pass over it. Tiresias emphasizes twice that he is blind to the physical details, but he is not blind to the greater significance of it. And the greater significance of it is the prophecy. It's the prophetic vision for what he sees in these two lovers. Tiresias is giving us what is probably the model for all sexual encounters in this modern era. This is what they will be like. He is foretelling the rest. He is prophesying what love has been reduced to, and it looks like this. I, too, awaited the expected guest. So he has a overarching or metacognitive level of perception on this scene. He is witness to this interaction. He, the young man, carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk. So notice this is no grand knight. This is no great story of romance as from the medieval period, where the grand knight would return and pay homage to his courtly love. This is just an agent's clerk with one bold stare. One of the low, on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. So he is a common house agent's clerk. He is a low-class man, yet he has the assurance of a Bradford millionaire, or the kind of a Bradford millionaire was someone who was rich during the war and possibly as a result of involvement in the war. So he's a low-class man, but quite narcissistic. Assurance that sits like a millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The time is right for a lover's interaction. He has returned home from sea. She has prepared a place for him. The setting seems appropriate for a grand reuniting of husband and wife. But we have no such thing. The meal is ended. They share a meal together. She is bored and tired. There's our first indication that this is not a romantic experience, at least not for her. She is bored and tired, and he endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved, if undesired. This is an interesting phrase here. That his caresses are not desired by her, possibly the way in which he is attempting to caress her, or what he is ultimately aiming for, but they are not reproved. She does nothing. This lack of agency on the part of the typist is a big deal. That she does not desire his caresses, but does not reprove them. She does not stop them. She does nothing to hinder his advances. Flushed and decided, committed to his actions, he assaults at once. So this recalls the rape of Philomela, a rudely forced sexual encounter. Now, the man, after the meal, without much dialogue or conversation or intimacy, engages her in caresses. She does nothing to hinder him. He decides, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. She does not resist. How can she? His vanity requires no response. He doesn't need her to love him in return, to give him any kind gestures in return. He is not looking for love, or at least a requited love. His vanity, his narcissism, his commitment to raping her and getting what he desires doesn't require any response from her. He will simply use her as an object. Makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have foresuffered all, enacted on this same divan or bed. Tiresias is the appropriate narrator because he can empathize with this situation. The one who is foretelling the rest has foresuffered all. Tiresias is a figure from history and from mythology that has experienced the same corruption and perversion of sexual union, enacted on this same divan or bed. I who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. Tiresias can comment on this degradation because he has been there. He has seen it for himself. It is not new. This kind of interaction between men and women is not new, yet in the wasteland it might be all they have left. The man bestows one final patronizing kiss, not loving. And it's hard to avoid seeing patronizing from the root word of patronage, that he is purchasing or sponsoring this sexual act, much like a prostitute. He gives her one patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs, unlit. He leaves in darkness. And thus concludes our grand moment of intimacy and reunion. This typist passage, which had all the trappings of a classic grand homecoming and reuniting of lovers after a long time apart, completely dissolves in our hands. This is not a great love poem. This is not a wonderful evening as lovers. She prepares a place for him. He is entirely neglectful of her work. She is tired, she is bored, and he assaults her sexually, leaving, once he is finished, in the dark. This is the plight of the modern world. And now we move to perhaps the most tragic scene in the fire sermon itself, and perhaps in the wasteland as a whole. This is the typist's reflection on the evening and its deviation from her expectations, its falling apart, its fading from the ideal love affair that she would have hoped for. She reflects on this experience in pure dismay and bleakness. He leaves in the dark. She turns and looks a moment in the glass. This self-reflection. Trying to understand what went wrong, why, perhaps even if it were her fault. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. This is no intimate relationship. She barely knows he is left. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. So she has the strength and endurance after this brutal assault and disregard of her being and her identity from this man, this horrible rape that she's encountered. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass, and this thought might serve as an anthem or as an overall truth to what has happened to sexuality and romance in the wasteland. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. She does not finish the sex act with a greater love and respect and appreciation for her lover. There is not a greater sense of community and bond between the two. This is not a marriage. This is not a life. And she's looking in the mirror after this moment, after this horrific moment. And the one thought that passes in her mind is that now it's done, and I'm glad it's over. And sexuality presented as a thing to be endured is perhaps one of the most tragic reductions in the wasteland. Certainly this fundamental aspect of human experience has shattered. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again, alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand. This is a gesture that is no longer in her own doing. This seems to be caught as much in the routine and mechanics of her situation and of her experiences, and puts a record on the gramophone. She seeks an escape from the tragic realities of her life, the horrible disappointments of her love and of her dreams that she escapes through the act of listening to music. Which again, remember at the beginning of the passage, the prayer that the Thames would sing would run softly till I end my song. And here we see the irony that she has just begun the song, but the song of her life and of her hopes and of her desires has certainly ended. This music crept by me upon the waters. We see the music that she engages in the aftermath of such a destructive and disappointing encounter. This music crept by me upon the waters, along the Strand, up Queen Victoria Street. Oh, city, city. So the music is filtering throughout all of London. that we are funneling out from a very narrow perspective on the scene that Tiresias witnesses and narrates, the woman looking in the glass, wishing for a greater life, wishing for a greater experience, and seeking to cope with her losses and her disappointments through music. And now that music ushers us to a wider scope, a grander scene, as it floods all of London, along the Strand, up Queen Victoria Street. "Oh, city, city, I can sometimes hear," back to Tiresias, lamenting and commenting on this loss of true love and intimacy. "I can sometimes hear, beside a public bar in Lower Thames Street, the pleasant whining of a mandolin, and a clatter and a chatter from within, where fishmen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold." Now, this is an interesting contrast that Tiresias is asking us to see. So he leaves the scene of the typist as she is lost in complete disarray and despair over the encounter that she has just endured, wishing for something grander. The music funnels us out into the streets of London, and Tiresias says in the public bars of Lower Thames, the fishermen's lounges, all of these common, lowbrow places in London that he sees people interacting. In the midst of all that, he sees the image of a grand city. "Oh, city, city, I can hear." The music evokes an image of the walls of Magnus Martyr, which is an Anglican church in London. A beautiful church. And the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendor. And this splendor is in direct contrast to the loneliness and loss that the typist has experienced. It's a dream. It's a desire for something lovely and perfect and holy and beautiful to still exist in such a land where this kind of interaction is still normal, is still typical. This interaction between the typist and her quote-unquote lover. The music evokes a desire. Remember in the Burial of the Dead, memory and desire. The music that she puts on the gramophone, that Tiresias hears flowing throughout all of London, brings back the memory of a greater time when love was satisfying and pure, and a desire for something splendid, something beautiful, a place of white and gold. And interestingly, it's in the walls of a church that is located for Tiresias. It's not the pub, it's not the streets of London, it's not the fishermen's lounges, it's not the clatter and chatter from within. It's what those things can remind him of. An ultimate place of splendor, inexplicable splendor. Perhaps there is a place beyond this wasteland where love can be meaningful again, where beauty can be appropriated and seen and appreciated and honored, where men and women can truly live together in harmony. We move toward the end of the fire sermon with two stanzas that are quite abrupt and disorienting, particularly because they deviate from the structure of the rest of the section. Here in this scene, we have what is probably a lament from the Thames Maidens, a reference perhaps to the nymphs that departed. And essentially we are seeing what has happened to the Thames now. The river sweats oil and tar, so there's pollution. The Thames that was sweet, that once ran softly, is now sweating oil and tar. It is filthy and corroded. The barges drift. They are aimless in direction. With the turning tide, red sails wide to leeward swing on the heavy spar. The barges wash drifting logs down Greenwich Reach, past the Isle of Dogs. Wee-la-la-la-la, wa-la-la-la-la-la. This is a lament. This is a song from the maidens lamenting the loss of the Thames. In the second section, we have a description of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, the most revered queen in British history, and Leicester. Beating oars, the stern was formed, a gilded shell, red and gold. The brisk swell rippled both shores. Southwest wind carried downstream, the peal of bells, white towers, wee-la-la-lea, wa-la-la-lea-la-la. This is again the lament of the Thames maidens. But now we move from the lower class description of the Thames, of the typist rather, and her lover, to now a very high class, royal description of Queen Elizabeth I and a perceived lover in Leicester. The problem with this encounter is that Queen Elizabeth I was the Virgin Queen, that she was certainly restricted from, either by her own choosing or by matters of state, that perhaps it was best for the country for her to be unaligned to any other country through marriage. Perhaps it made England more stable, gave it more control over foreign affairs and policies. But her virginity and her commitment to that presents a problem, that there is no real prospect for pure ideal union or love between these perceived possible lovers for another reason. But now we move to a separate voice altogether. We go from Tiresias to the laments of the Thames maidens. Now we have an unidentified female voice also commenting on a sexual encounter of her own. Trams and dusty trees. Remember at the beginning of the section we saw that the river's tint was broken. The trees that sheltered the Thames and the lovers beneath it is broken and falling apart. Now it's dusty. Highbury bore me. Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. Here we have a rather frank and candid view of the sex act. And she says all these different places, Highbury, Richmond, Kew, where she engaged in sexual encounters with various men, they undid her. They caused her to unravel. By Richmond, she says, I raised my knees, supine on the floor, lying back of a narrow canoe. So there we have her rather unremorseful, unregretting description of sex with an unnamed man or a variety of men. My feet are at Moorgate, my heart under my feet. So this goes back to the typist, that a recognition that love has been trampled upon, has fallen apart, and been reduced to simply a matter of endurance. The woman endured the sex act simply to get it over with. Any kind of meaning or pleasure or joy that once was a part of it is now simply over, and it's just a matter of survival. Here we see the same concept from this voice. She says, my feet are at Moorgate, another place. That's where she literally is. But her heart, her emotions, her love are trampled under feet. Her heart has been trampled. After the event, notice how she describes sex. After the event, he wept. He promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? So notice how the reversal of typical gender roles has occurred. She is unremorseful. She has no emotional investment in the encounter. Her heart is under her feet. He weeps. He feels regret at the lack of intimacy and lack of significance of what they've engaged in. He promises a new start. Hint at a relationship. But interestingly, she is silent. I made no comment. Remember, in a game of chess, the wife is urging the husband to speak. Why do you never speak? And he doesn't speak. He is the one who's silent. Now we have those roles reversed, where the man is now promising for a relationship. He is weeping at the loss of meaning and loss of significance that their sexual encounter has. He is mourning the loss of permanence and satisfaction to what they've done, but she makes no comment. And she says, what should I resent? What do I have to regret? And so she represents the more bitter, cold, calculating, unfeeling, numb character in this engagement. On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. Again, remember in a game of chess, all they can see, all they can speak, and all they can hear is nothing. Nothing upon nothing. The silence at the door can be more deafening. Interestingly, Margate sands is the exact location where Eliot's wife, Vivian, betrayed T.S. Eliot. She committed an affair. An adulterous affair with Bertrand Russell. And so the inability to connect anything, the inability to make sense of anything regarding sexuality and romance in the modern world has a personal tint to it for Eliot. Margate sands is the place where he personally saw a deterioration of the honorable, sacred marriage vow and the honor and beauty of true love between husband and wife. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. That is all we have left. Not pure, unblemished hands deserving of rings, holding one another as they exchange vows. All we have are broken fingernails. An image of ugliness. And dirty hands. An image of sin. And filth. And tainted personhood. My people humble people who expect nothing. We can connect nothing with nothing. We expect nothing. For the typist, after her love affair that went awry, she expects nothing better for herself. She says this is simply the way things are, and she attempts to escape that reality through music. Knowingly, music as an unsatisfying agent of escape. We have the brief interruption of the Thames Maidens singing one last time. And then we have this amalgamation of two different spiritual voices. A Western voice in St. Augustine, and the Eastern voice of Buddha. To Carthage then I came is a description of Augustine. He eventually became the bishop of Carthage, and it's there that he discovered that city to be a vast nest and den of unholy, degenerate citizens. He describes that event in his Confessions. To Carthage then I came, and then we get this interrupted voice from Buddha, burning, 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 burning. Again, the description of all of the different capacities of man to desire must be burned. They must be rid of. They must be eliminated. We shift back to Augustine here. O Lord, the prayer to God, thou pluckest me out. Thou pluckest. And this harkens back to the typist, where she seeks music as a way of plucking her out of the disappointing den of failure and despair that she is currently trapped in. She is seeking for something to pluck her out of that monotonous, unsatisfying experience, and she seeks that in music. She puts a record on the gramophone, and that music filters out into London and reminds Tiresias of the inexplicable splendor of heaven, the walls of the church that describe the gold and glory of God's eternal city. And here, Augustine goes to the very unholy city of Carthage and prays to the Lord to pluck him out. Thou pluckest me out. Thou pluckest. And yet this prayer does not reach a consummation. We see it without any real conclusion, with the last word of the sermon, the last word of the section, the fire sermon, given to Buddha, burning, the burning of desire, the elimination of desire, as the only way to cope with suffering. But we see these two different sources intimated. There's the Augustinian Christian method to pray to God for relief and comfort, and ultimately to be plucked out of the wasteland itself, this world that is falling apart, this world that is dented and scratched and doomed. And we had the advice and caution of the Buddha that the only way to escape the suffering of the wasteland is to rid yourself of any desire whatsoever. To become truly and totally numb is the only way to cope. And it's on his note, burning of desire, that we end the fire sermon.